Karl Marx is perhaps derided by his critics for being too utopian. But ironically, his theory is actually anti-utopian. Yet there are also some kind of utopian, anti-utopian tensions within his historical materialism and within his revolutionary theorizing. And that's really what I want to get at in this lecture video is what exactly is Marx's criticism of utopianism, but also how does his thinking lend him to a kind of utopianism, such that I think we can qualify or characterize Marx as an anti-utopian utopian. I want to begin with these two quotes, actually. The first from the Theses on Feuerbach, where Marx is criticizing the philosopher Feuerbach, and it's the 11th, one of the most famous quotes from Marx, but I think it really captures what he sees as the point of philosophy, or what it ought to be. He says, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. So one shouldn't just neutrally seek a theory of justice or something like that, just trying to get at the mere truth of it. But you should try to understand the world so you can understand its mechanisms to unravel the contradictions within social existence. Right? So it doesn't mean that you want to try to offer theories that can just persuade people so that way you can kind of achieve your own goals in a kind of like relativistic way. But you should actually tap into what actually is social existence. What are its laws, if there are any? Right? And this is why with Marx's later works and Capital and so on, he really is kind of one of the fathers of sociology, as well as, of course, his contributions to the history of economic thought. The second quote I want to look at is my favorite quote by Marx, where he says, "It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness." So it's not that we can just, as philosophers, think about, use logic, think about the laws of the world, come to a, perfect theory of justice or of legitimacy or of anything else like that, which in some way is free of all the kind of influences of political life, economic laws, or anything like that. But instead, our ideas are reflective. They are informed. Now, they're not entirely determined such that, well, as soon as I'm, living in poverty, I'm all of a sudden convinced by other kind of theories or whatever. But it's that general social existence, the means of production, how society maintains its subsistence, that really informs the kinds of both ideas that justify it and then also their opposites, the contradictory, really the contradictions that lead to these opposing kinds of theories. So, of course, we have dialectics at play here in Marx's thought. At the end of the Manifesto of the Communist Party, Marx criticizes what he calls the Utopian Socialists. Now, they didn't call themselves Utopian Socialists, but some of the most notable are Henri de Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, and Robert Owen. And what they basically did was try to theorize what is a kind of arrangement of social existence that enables the values of humanity to flourish, right? So how do we overcome slavery of human beings? How do we overcome unjust authority and so on? And they were really about, especially, some more than other, really about wanting to test their utopian theories, such that they would want to build, community on its own, see how it would work, learn from it. So they're almost kind of like they're almost kind of proponents of what you would think of communes. Like, for example, in Tennessee, there's this one in Summertown, Tennessee. And so they would want to say, well, we have different kinds of tests, experiments of social living. We see which ones work in certain ways or don't. But they also thought that, some of them being more a bit empirically minded as well with rational thinking in this way. But some of them were much more utopian in the sense that they thought you could use reason entirely to have an entirely rational planning of, for example, a city. And so they would have such descriptions of cities down to the very, what the houses would look like, to exactly how tall they would be, and so on and so forth, the floor plans of housing and things like that. So they were these kind of eccentric thinkers, but they were very serious thinkers. And Marx both praises and criticizes them. His praise of the Utopian Socialists is that they basically get right, pointing out the kind of class antagonisms in society, that they are critical of domination in all its forms. And he even says that they attack every principle of existing society. Hence, they are full of the most valuable materials for the enlightenment of the working class. The practical measures proposed in them, such as the abolition of the distinction between town and country, of the family, of the carrying on of industries for the account of private individuals, and of the wage system. All these proposals point solely to the disappearance of class antagonisms. So the Utopian Socialists, in their theorizing of utopias, they offer a radical critique of actually existing society, highlighting all of its contradictions and what it might be like to live without them. On the other hand, though, Marx is critical from the standpoint that they really lack a kind of revolutionary fervor. This begins to stem from their kind of anti-historicism, such that they think that they can just use reason, divorced from material historical conditions, to think, well, universally, what is the most rational organization of human beings in a social setting? And Marx likens this to the fact that when they're theorizing, some of them in the late 18th century, others in the early 19th century, they're really kind of at the beginning of capitalism, at the infancy of the proletariat, that they don't really yet see the kind of trajectory of history working through capitalism and the formation of class conflict. And so this leads them to think that they can invent new social laws to create new social conditions. And of course, Marx's criticism, whether it be in the German ideology or elsewhere, is that it's ridiculous to think that you can change material and social conditions just by merely coming up with new ideas. He says, hence they reject all political and especially all revolutionary action. They wish to attain their ends by peaceful means and endeavor by small experiments necessarily doomed to failure and by the force of example to pave the way for the new social gospel. That it's really the problem of these utopian socialists is they think they can just theorize what is objectively, rationally the best arrangement of social living, and that this is going to kind of percolate. People are going to, through the use of reason, realize, this is the best way to live, and people will start to move towards living that way. But Marx is like, no, you have to engage in politics. You actually have to engage in class struggle to change the very material and social dynamics that you are critical of. I also want to turn to his critique of the Gotther Program, because in this I think we get really into the nitty-gritty about why it's so difficult to actually theorize utopia, even communism. So the Gotther Program was basically the party platform that was adopted by the Social Democratic Party of Germany, where they called for universal suffrage, freedom of association, limits on the working day, and other rights for workers that nominally, Marx, of course, is advocating for. He focuses on the entire Gotther Program, but I just want to focus on the third line, where they say, the emancipation of labor demands the promotion of the instruments of labor to the common property of society and the cooperative regulation of the total labor with the fair distribution of the proceeds of labor. So you might think, okay, that sounds like pretty socialistic insofar as they're saying, look, we want to emancipate kind of workers from working for being enslaved to the bourgeoisie. We want a fair distribution of the proceeds of labor such that all of property is communally owned. But Marx's first question is, okay, but you mentioned this idea of a fair distribution of the proceeds of labor that are going to come from, using capital. What exactly is a fair distribution? And he says, do not the bourgeois assert that the present day distribution is fair? And is it not, in fact, the only fair distribution on the basis of the present day mode of production? Are economic relations regulated by legal conceptions, or do not, on the contrary, legal relations arise from economic ones? So, isn't the case that when you want to talk about fair, well, that has to correspond to an actual social practice? And in capitalism, the way that it works such that the owner of capital invests all that money and they hire voluntarily, individually in a voluntary way, each worker, that it's fair that they agree to work for a certain wage and that the boss gets to decide what to do with it, because according to that mode of production, that's how it's justified socially. Everybody kind of understands that. So how can you then speak to a new conception of fair that doesn't yet correspond to any kind of social reality? It doesn't correspond to any kind of practices that people engage in, and that would intuitively make sense to them. Some of this I think we can see coming from this line in the German ideology, where he says, the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas, i.e., the class which is the ruling material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. The ruling ideas are nothing more than the ideal expression of the dominant material relationships. The dominant material relationships grasped as ideas. And so why is it, for example, that the concept of private property that is theorized in Nozick or just in general within the capitalist era, why is that so essential? Why does Locke talk about private property as being one of the natural rights of only three? And Marx is going to say, well, Locke is living in a kind of proto-capitalist era where society is starting to be organized around the lines of private property, serving at the foundation of industry, of the subsistence of society. And so the ideas that people are kind of unconsciously going to develop are going to be reflective of the very social and material circumstances in which they exist. So I want to read further what he says on the critique of the Gotther Program here. So he says, but all members of society in equal right are obviously mere phrases. The kernel consists in this, that in this communist society, every worker must receive the undiminished Lassallean proceeds of labor. But let us take first all the words, proceeds of labor, in the sense of the product of labor. Then the cooperative proceeds of labor are the total social product. So here he's basically going to deconstruct how the proceeds of labor is rationalized within a capitalist system, and why they're wanting to appeal to a new kind of normative sense of fair distribution of the proceeds of labor doesn't yet make sense insofar as it corresponds to our intuitive sense. So he says, from this must now be deducted, first, cover for replacement of the means of production used up. So of course, the owner of capital has to be compensated for fronting the capital. Secondly, additional portion for expansion of production. That has to be taken out of the proceeds of labor. So basically, he's asking, well, when we talk about the profit that's made from labor, when we sell goods, where all does that have to go to before we can talk about, a kind of free distribution of those proceeds? Thirdly, reserve or insurance funds to provide against accidents, dislocations caused by natural calamities, etc. These deductions from the undiminished proceeds of labor are an economic necessity, and their magnitude is to be determined according to available means and forces, and partly by computation of probabilities, but they are in no way calculable by equity. There remains the other part of the total product, intended to serve as means of consumption. Before this is divided among the individuals, there has to be deducted again from it. First, the general costs of administration, not belonging to production. This part will, from the outset, be very considerably restricted in comparison with the present-day society, and it diminishes in proportion as the new society develops. Secondly, that which is intended for the common satisfaction of needs, such as schools, health services, etc. Right, so now he's looking at, well, look, the production of goods even if you want to arrange it along new lines, it's taking place within the context of a larger capitalist paradigm. So you're still going to need to account for example, the use of profit for advertising, to improve machinery, to improve the rate of production. You're going to need it to pay taxes, which is going to have to go to these things like, again, schools and so on, health services. Continuing, from the outset, this part grows considerably in comparison with present-day society, and it grows in proportion as the new society develops. Thirdly, funds for those unable to work, etc. In short, for what is included under so-called official poor relief today, or just kind of welfare programs, you might think. Only now do we come to the distribution which the program, under Lassallean influence, alone has in view in its narrow fashion, namely, to that part of the means of consumption which is divided among the individual producers of the cooperative society. The undiminished proceeds of labor have already and noticeably become converted into the diminished proceeds. So what undiminished proceeds? How can you talk about a free and fair distribution of the proceeds of labor if it's still taking place overall within a global capitalist paradigm? You have to account for all these other things that profit is going to have to go to before it even gets to be distributed fairly among the workers. He says, just as the phrase of the undiminished proceeds of labor has disappeared, so now does the phrase of the proceeds of labor disappear altogether. Within the cooperative society based on common ownership of the means of production, the producers do not exchange their products. Just as little does the labor employed on the products appear here as the value of these products, as a materialist quality possessed by them, since now, in contrast to capitalist society, individual labor no longer exists in an indirect fashion, but directly as a component part of the total labor. He says, what we have to deal with here is a communist society, not as it has developed on its own foundations, but on the contrary, just as it emerges from capitalist society, which is thus in every respect economically, morally, and intellectually still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it emerges. So the issue with the Gotther Program here, and wanting to talk about implementing a new kind of fair distribution of the proceeds of labor, is that it's still going to be within a capitalist paradigm. So that it's as if they want to forcefully implement a new system without taking into the fact of how do you actually undergo that transition? Where's the transitional theory? One of the biggest arguments we get from Marx in his critique of the Gotther Program is that it's actually not possible to theorize the conditions of communism prior to the preconditions being realized. That you cannot really even understand the kind of principles that would undergird, that would make possible communist existence, because they don't correspond to any kind of a social and material circumstances. They lack normative force because normativity arises from the roles and the social relations between persons. So Marx does not actually offer a full account of communism, of how it works. He doesn't think that's possible. You have to focus on first transitional theory. The problem for the Gotther Program is it attempts to establish the conditions of communism prior to realizing its preconditions, prior to changing the mode of production, the kind of basic working, the foundation of society. For Marx, only once the contradictions of the productive forces of society, in all its forms, have been resolved, can a communist society be based upon the notion, as he says, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Now, we might say, well, it looks like he's offering a kind of principle of communism, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And he does. But this is notoriously vague. He does not try to theorize how this actually makes sense. I think this is perhaps most evident in the Communist Manifesto, where many people, when they read the Communist Manifesto, they take this kind of 10 points here as to how society should be arranged as like the utopia of communism, what communism would look like. But what Marx and Engels write is not an account of communism. It's an account of transitional policy. It's an account of what you have to do to transition from a communist society to establish the preconditions necessary to then move to a communist society. So when he writes about the abolition of private property, progressive income tax, abolition of all rights of inheritance, confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels, centralization of all credit in the hands of the state, centralization of the means of transportation and communication, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, equal liability of all to labor, a combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries by a gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country, and free education for all children in public schools and abolition of all child labor. These are policies that enable the dissolution of the capitalist class, the dissolution of class antagonism entirely. But it doesn't tell you then what beyond this transitional phase, what communism would actually look like. Because, for example, it wouldn't make sense to have a progressive income tax if all property is communally owned. So it's really important to see what Marx is doing. He's criticizing certain utopian theorists for thinking that they can just theorize utopia and that the power of ideas will enable people to see that they should change their social relations. Instead, of course, you have to work from the ground up, change social relations that then influences how people think. He's critical of this idea that you can offer the principles and the policies of a communism or a utopianism in general, and without engaging in a kind of revolutionary transitional theory. And so here we have him offering, with Engels, what a transitional theory would look like, what is required in policy to overcome the contradictions of capitalism, establish the preconditions such that the material forces of production are communally owned, so then you can move to rearranging society along new lines. We do actually get one vision of communism, utopian vision of communism. I think it's important that we see it as a vision, insofar as a vision points to something. It allows us to see what might be. It's aspirational, but it's not the development of universal transcendent principles. In the German ideology, Marx says, "For as soon as the distribution of labor comes into being, each man has a particular exhaustive sphere of activity, which is forced upon him and from which he cannot escape. He is a hunter, a fisherman, a shepherd, or a critical critic, and must remain so if he does not want to lose his means of livelihood." So, in capitalism, each person, in a sense, must pick a profession. They become defined by that profession in all spheres of their life. But, he says, while in communist society, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, to fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, shepherd, or critic. So in communism, it's not that you're defined by one activity and you have to make that kind of all that dominates all aspects of your livelihood in order for you to survive, to receive the means of subsistence. But in communism, if you establish certain preconditions such that your most basic needs are met, it frees you up to pursue. Perhaps I want to get into painting. Later on, maybe I can take the risk of stop engaging in painting and go to school to become educated in some profession, right? It frees you from the fear of, for example, well, if I quit this job, what if I lose my health care, Continuing this quote, he says, "This fixation of social activity, this consolidation of what we ourselves produce into an objective power above us, growing out of our control, thwarting our expectations, bringing to naught our calculations, is one of the chief factors in historical development up till now." So this idea, he's saying that he's showing us this picture of what communist existence might look like. It's not that he's thought it up his own. He's looked at what are the contradictions in capitalist society. What do they stop people from doing? And that's what he's trying to disclose, what he's trying to bring out from those contradictions, what the overcoming of those contradictions might lead to. It's important to note that Marx really refrains from engaging in anything like this again, really after the Communist Manifesto is published. He starts working on economics and sociology first and foremost in the 3 and really 4 volumes of Capital and so on, or the 18th Brumaire, this kind of sociological work. He really becomes focused on trying to understand how capitalism works, such that we can best work in revolutionary transitional theory and not worry about what the end goal might look like. That's kind of a distraction. And yet I think the question is that really a distraction? Is this utopian vision that Marx has offered here, is it irrelevant? Does it hurt his project overall? Is that why he, refrains from engaging in anything like that in the second half of his life? Or was there maybe a necessary reason why he would write such a thing, like a vision of communist existence, that he wanted to deny? That perhaps for normative reasons, perhaps for methodological reasons. So I want to end by looking at 2 kinds of criticisms, or even really interpretations of what's going on with Marx's anti-utopian utopianism. So I think a question that arises really from the work of Daniel Brudny is how it's possible to transcend the current material and social paradigm if all ideas are made possible and then justified by that very same material and social apparatus, that is capitalism. So how is it possible to actually move beyond capitalism and talk about the contradictions, how they would unravel and they will necessarily lead to communism, if the ideas you are advocating are informed by, or made sense, or only possible within a capitalist framework, right? So how do you then transcend it? How do you have a theory which transcends your current conditions? Because the preconditions of communism do not exist. So where does the normative justification, where does the normative force for the ideal of communism come from? How do you get workers to recognize the normativity of communism, and how do you get them to recognize, for example, themselves being alienated, and that being free from alienation, being overcoming capitalism has normative justification to it? Because it seems like that normative justification of a kind of freer society, we don't yet have those preconditions. They don't yet exist. And this is where I think it's really important to consider Daniel Brudny's argument from his book, Marx's Attempt to Leave Philosophy. He basically argues that Marx cannot give normative force to his political theory without an implicit appeal to a transcendent moral value. In other words, he can't justify overthrowing the chains of capitalism without appeal to a value that is justified by an apparatus of social relations that does not yet exist. So whereas Marx wants to deny engaging in a kind of moralism that's focused on, the idea of the transcendent good and so on, and he's just interested in a kind of materialist philosophy, whether that be historical materialism or dialectical materialism, well, perhaps there's a reason why he was a bit more, some people say, humanistic in his earlier works, like in the Paris manuscripts, or in the German ideology, or even the Communist Manifesto to some extent. And maybe that's why he offers the image of existence in communism, but which he wants to try and deny. And maybe he was wrong to think that he didn't need to engage in that kind of moralism. Lastly, I want to look at 5 interpretations then of Marxist anti-utopianism. What exactly then is his criticism of utopianism. There are 5 different interpretations. The first 4 are really kind of just restated by Payton in his article, Marx's Critique of the Utopian Socialists, and the final interpretation is actually Payton's own. The first interpretation is the tactical criticism, that basically when Marx and Engels are criticizing utopianism and the Utopian Socialists, they're really saying that utopian thinking is a waste of political time and energy. That because it's just really interested in developing ideas and kind of new isolated experiments, it doesn't engage in the right ways political dialogue and political policies. The second interpretation is that what's going on is a kind of strategic criticism, that communism can only be achieved by a revolution, and the utopians in their, trying to expound and articulate this rational society, they're not engaged in revolution. They're not interested in actually overthrowing the fundamental basis of society. The third interpretation is that what's going on in Marx and Engels' criticism of utopianism is that they think that the kind of methodology employed by the Utopian Socialists and other philosophers is a kind of dubious methodology, where their utopian visions are based entirely on epistemologically questionable moral principles, because they think that they can theorize the good or theorize the just, theorize the ideal society objectively, free from the influence of unconscious material and social forces. So there are ideas that are suspect, and we might want to question, to what extent are they ideological? The fourth interpretation of Marx and Engels' anti-utopianism is the humanist criticism, that the Utopian Socialists specifically adopted a mistaken view of human nature, deriving it from a false set of moral principles and utopian ideals. With their sense of what the nature of humanity is, kind of what the virtues of humanity are, they mistook kind of virtues that become prominent in capitalist society for being natural, universal, transcendent human virtues. And that it's not possible if, human social existence and the ideas, how humans make sense of themselves, is determined by their social being. The final interpretation of Marxist anti-utopianism is Payton's own. It's a meta-ethical criticism. So it's not an outright rejection of utopianism, but instead it's actually a critique of the utopians for, in a way, kind of advocating a dystopia. So Payton says that it's that a utopia is not a society that conforms in all its detail to some predetermined conception of the good, but instead a utopia is a society that permits and encourages its members to develop and change social institutions in accordance with the changing ideas of the good arrived at through free and open dialogue. And that makes sense if our ideas are informed by our social and material circumstances, that then our conception of the good would change over time. And so you couldn't have just one transcendent conception of the ideal society. So, continuing, he says, because they must do this through such an ongoing process, this discursive utopia must be designed in such a way as to guarantee the permanent possibility of such a discussion. That if you're going to theorize utopian conditions of ideal existence, you have to theorize what would be a kind of open-ended possibility of political dialogue, such that those conditions, those utopian conditions, could be open to revision. Therefore, Payton says, it is necessary that such a utopia include a set of framework institutions to institutionalize this free and effective discursive process. These institutions would include virtually the same set of institutions that Marx envisioned to guarantee individual self-development in his developmentalist utopia, as these institutions would also guarantee that appropriate type of free debate essential to Marx's discursive utopia. So perhaps that's why Marx, maybe in the German ideology, only offers a vision of communist existence, not a set determination of what communism really looks like, because that can only be determined by human beings in that circumstance, in that time and place, of which Marx and all of us can have no knowledge of. Now, What is the correct interpretation of Marx and Engels' anti-utopianism? I think there are arguments to some extent for all of them, and some people basically try to argue for all the critiques. I think there is something to be said for the meta-ethical criticism, especially if we want to try to make sense of the perhaps unconscious moralism in Marx's philosophy, and how to make sense of his early appeals to a somewhat kind of utopian thinking, even if he was critical of utopianism. Perhaps that's the best way to make sense of his anti-utopian utopianism.